Good morning. Today is the day of the resurrection. Today we all gather together normally and say, He is risen. And whether we gather or not, it's still true. And today, as we come together this way, we have read together a story from the Gospel according to St. John. We've read the story about the day when Peter, John the Beloved, and Mary Magdalene discovered their resurrected Lord. And this is a special story. And I don't just mean it's special because of the resurrection. That is very true too. But not just the content. It's special for another reason, I think. And I'd like you to listen very carefully to the story from John's Gospel and hear the distinct differences between it and everything else that we've said today. Because this is the story that made John the evangelist, John the theologian, tell the world about his and the other disciples' unbridled joy. I'd like you to pay attention to the differences between this story and the beginning of John's Gospel. They're both in the same book, but they sound a little different. John begins this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Now that complicated sentence is an elaborate attempt by a gifted theologian to retell the story of creation, in which God spoke creation into being with a new character. Jesus in the Gospel of John's beginning is both person, he's a person, and the word by which God spoke everything into being. So that very complicated beginning places Jesus as the word by which creation was spoken into being. Jesus in the Gospel of John's beginning is both person and word. And it's all very complicated, and it's beautiful in its own way, but it's beautiful in the way that ideas are beautiful. It's theoretically beautiful. It's beautiful in the way of a new discovery, the joy of learning to read, the thrill of new understanding, or the satisfaction of connecting long, separated dots. The beginning of John's Gospel is not entirely different from the way that the Apostle Paul, in today's reading from Colossians, treated Jesus' resurrection. There, Paul suggests that through faith you have been raised with Christ. He suggests that you spiritually participate in Jesus' resurrection on Easter morning. He encourages you to set your mind on the God who lives above, because that's where your spiritual dwelling is now, thanks to Christ's dying and rising again. Paul is, in this reading, playing with the beautiful idea that the death of Christ, that in death, Christ died your death. And that in raising from the dead, Christ hid you in his risen self for safekeeping until the day of his glory. And that, like John's beginning, is a beautiful idea. And we believe that it's true. The truth is always beautiful. And all of these things draw their beginnings in the story of Jesus' death and resurrection on Easter morning. So you would expect that in his treatment of Jesus' resurrection, John the theologian would weave that story like he did the Word into creation. That he would weave the story of resurrection into the story of God, that he might be metaphorical, that he might play with these ideas. What act of God might be told and retold in the story of Jesus' resurrection? What eternal significance might be revealed in this telling? And those questions, the answer to those questions, is why this story is different. Because on Easter morning, John the Beloved was John the Ecstatic. In remembering and retelling that morning, John lost himself in joy. He took a little time to note that Jesus' resurrection had been promised, and that it's exactly this thing that they'd been waiting for. And when he saw it, he believed. there was so much good theology to follow this telling. And there's so much theology still to come. And we still proclaim the resurrection every Sunday, but for Peter, John, and Mary in John's telling, theology was future tense. The present, this story, was dominated by the joy of the resurrected Jesus. Easter morning, according to John, begins in the depths of grief. Kind of like our Triduum, our 3 days prior to Easter. Things begin on Maundy Thursday, bright and shiny as they normally are, but as the week progressed last week, we descended into a kind of darkness. And that's where we find ourselves on Easter morning. Mary Magdalene, recently bereft of her friend, went to Jesus' tomb, but the stone was rolled away. So Mary ran to Peter and John and said the words that would play on repeat in her aggrieved mind. "They have taken the Lord," she says, "and I don't know where they've put him." So John and Peter ran to the tomb of their friend and rabbi. They still didn't understand what Jesus meant when he said he would rise from the dead, but there was no time for that now because his body was missing. John arrived first, and we're told that he looked into his friend's tomb and saw clothes lying there where a body should be, empty. And he saw a face covering lying across the way, folded neatly. Peter was next to arrive. Now let me remind you that it's still Passover. Let remind you that there is nothing so contaminating, even on a common day, than to enter a tomb. Enter a tomb and you won't be allowed in the temple for a very long time. Worship, even in Passover, is off bounds for those who routinely inhabit tombs. But Peter's friend's body was missing, and Peter, still racked with the grief of Jesus' death and very likely still racked with the guilt of his own betrayal, flew into that tomb with no delay, no hesitation, and no mind for anything but Jesus. But he wasn't there. Now this right here is what you call dramatic tension. Enter Mary Magdalene. By this time, Peter and John had gone home. John mentioned something about the beloved disciple believing, but we aren't there yet because Mary still can't find her Lord. And then Jesus showed up. Mary, with her eyes clouded with tears, her mind clouded in the fog of grief, looked into the tomb and saw 2 angels. "Why are you crying?" they asked. But Mary didn't even register angels. She was stuck on repeat. "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him," she manages. And then she falls backwards and lands into the arms of Jesus. "Why are you crying?" Jesus asks. But she's still stuck. She's still looking for his body. She's still fixed on his body. And in her grief, she cannot bear to let go of that image, that loss of Jesus' body. "If you've taken him," she says, thinking Jesus to be the tomb's caretaker, "tell me where you've put him. I'll take him." It's the logic of grief. She needed something to hold on to, even if it was just a body. And then Jesus said her name, Mary. And immediately the fog lifted. I can see the moment perfectly in my mind. I can see the lights coming on in Mary's head, the fog of grief dissolving into the bright light of love. His name, her name for him, Rabboni, teacher, flying from her lips, her arms reaching up and out, wrapping themselves tightly around Jesus' neck, holding on. The resurrection is a beautiful idea. But for Mary at that moment, the resurrection was a warm, living body. The resurrection was that loving embrace. Jesus says some words that theologians have puzzled over for millennia, but are best interpreted, I think, instinctively. Don't hold on to me, he says, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Allow me to translate. Mary, I have work to do. I told you that I was going to the Father, and I'm going to go now, or at least very soon. You're going to have to let go. And I imagine that had Jesus not said those words, he might still be stuck in the garden of a tomb, pinned down by the power of a Jewish woman's love for him. This was the hug that could have easily outlasted the ascension. This moment has tremendous meaning. Jesus, who invited to carry your cross and follow me, invites all those who follow him into his resurrection. Death at this moment, that last great enemy, that last great evil, died because of the resurrection. Death that has held creation hostage since that moment just after creation, when humanity chose a tree, the fruit of knowledge over life. Since that moment, death has held all captive, and at that moment, at this moment, the moment of the resurrection, death gave way to recreation. Death gave way to life. And all of this because of the resurrection. And these are beautiful ideas. But when he remembered the morning of the resurrection, John the evangelist said, "This fulfills what Jesus had promised, and I believe." And then he got on with the story. He forgot to be metaphoric. He forgot to weave the story of Jesus into the grand narratives. He had time for 2 running disciples, an empty tomb, and an embrace that almost interrupted eternity. And he had time for the greatest words ever to be spoken by anyone, anywhere. I have seen the Lord. The joy of the risen Lord at that moment dispelled the grief of loss. The joy of the risen Lord carried Peter to a cross of his own, with the joy of resurrection still alive within him. That joy infected the Christian church and spread light and life into every moment, every feast, even every trial and persecution. And it's because of the resurrection that Christians still encourage one another in Easter to rejoice even in your distress, because we shall be counted worthy when Christ appears. Nothing has changed. Christ was risen on Easter morning. Christ is risen today. To borrow an Easter message from my favorite Christmas carol, then told the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor does he sleep. In these times, in this season, despite everything else that's going on, I would encourage you to find the joy of the risen Lord. Not to ignore trouble or minimize it, not to be irresponsible, insensitive, or unloving, but to allow the joy of the risen Lord to rise in your hearts, to embrace him even now. Because despite whatever else is going on with human bodies, your life is forever hidden in Christ. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory.